Is it?
Recording.
Okay.
There we go.
All right.
Got it.
This is the Terry. We can see that you joined us. You are muted, but I hope that you can hear me, hear us. Mike Drelichars is on, and Martha
He's
and
muted too.
Jules are on.
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. We were just talking about the main theme of the book of Jonah. This is the final session in this series. What I had asked you to read for this week is the last chapter, which is the one where Jonah gets angry because God is so generous. God is so forgiving, and it really goes back to the original kind of the original thesis, which is when God chose Jonah to go talk to the Ninevites, his hesitancy was that God is merciful and God would save the Ninevites, which he didn't want to participate in. We've gone through the kind of the scenes of his disobedience, the consequences of his disobedience, essentially, eventually getting thrown into the sea. God still delivering him. The fish is the sign. Potentially, it could have been of his, destruction. A fish that could engulf him could digest him, but that's not what happened in this story. In the belly of the fish, remember chapter 2, in the belly of the fish, Jonah writes this psalm of praise to God and his anticipation of God's deliverance of him even now, and even frames the fish itself as being a gift from God sent for his deliverance. And then again, that chapter ends with the narrator, no longer Jonah, who wrote the psalm or this song. Then that goes back to the narrator, who says, "Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land." So it brings back that the notion that God is really manipulating and calling the shots throughout this story. That the God is not just letting nature take its course, but God is directing stuff that goes on in this story. God calls Jonah a second time, and this time Jonah goes to Nineveh.
You want to be in that fish again.
Right.
No,
I've been there for
Uppercut.
3 days and I don't want to go back.
No.
Yeah. So this time he goes to Nineveh. Remember, Nineveh is the kind of the Death Star of the empire. It's the nerve center of this this empire that was the enemy of everything that the Israelites held near and dear. And as the story goes, in just one day of preaching, Jonah creates a cascade of repentance, and everybody who hears him starts repenting, and it cascades in this case not downward from but upward to the king himself, who says, oh yeah, look, everybody is acknowledging the truth of Jonah's message. And again, it's way over the top. There's not a shred of evidence in any document other than this story that there was ever any kind of mass conversion of the Ninevites, the empire. This is a story that is using contemporary events to convey a story about God's overwhelming grace, and that grace is not just for Israel. So and it's really as I said last week, chapter 3 ends with, when God saw what they did, that is their mass conversion, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. God changed his mind, and I think that's kind of a logical place to end the story. Happily ever after.
It's not.
But it's not.
We still have to deal with Jonah.
But it's not, because the author still wants Jonah to be so dumb about understanding this message that he has to be taught by a plant and a worm. And that's what happens then here in chapter 4. Does someone want to start reading chapter 4? Or let me stop there and see, before we do, stop and see if there's any questions or comments.
I have one comment.
Sure, go ahead.
Question.
Mike.
I'm not sure how you want to phrase it. It's interesting that in this 4th chapter, Jonah's upset that God showed his graciousness on the Ninevites, yet he wasn't upset when God was gracious when he was in the belly of the whale.
Yeah,
seems a little hypocritical.
Yeah, it's God is all about grace when it comes to me. There's probably God has to use some judgment about whether to allow you into his kingdom, but not me.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, that just thought or comment.
That's very exactly pertinent to this theme. So who's going to read?
I would. I'll
Okay.
volunteer. Okay. But this was very displeasing to Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is not this what I said while I was still in my own country? That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing."
Okay, let's
And
stop there. Let's stop there, Terry. Sorry to interrupt, but again, to remind you that this little bit of our liturgy comes from
Mhm.
this angry tirade, really, by Jonah, and it here again, I hope you see the humor, at least the irony, in the fact that Jonah is getting so angry about God's graciousness,
Right.
and and um and it's, again, God's graciousness for these others who don't seem to deserve it the way I do. Okay. uh Go ahead with
Verse 3.
verse 3. Yeah.
And now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. For the Lord said, is it right for you to be angry? Then Jonah went out of the city and sat down east of the city and made a broth for him.
A booth.
And made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade, waiting to see what would become of the city.
Can't you just see that scene? He went to
Yeah.
the highest place so he could see the most destruction.
Mhm. The Lord God appointed a bush and made it come up over Jonah to give shade over his head, to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was very happy about that, the bush. Of course he was. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the bush so that it withered. When the sun rose, God prepared a sultry east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint and asked that he might die. He said, it is better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the bush? And he said, yes, angry enough to die.
You just have to laugh. You have to laugh at that.
Then the Lord said, you are concerned about the bush for which you did not labor and which you did not grow. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals? And that's where it
and
ends.
and that's where, yeah,
Also many
that's
animals? Question mark.
yeah, that and that's where the curtain comes down.
Well,
And
Jonah,
go ahead.
I think there is very selfish.
Yep.
It's about him and his comfort and the loss of his bush,
Yeah.
but he doesn't care about the loss of how many countless numbers of people, and the ones who can't tell their right from their left are the children, right?
Right.
So,
Mhm.
Yeah, he's kind of
Yeah.
selfish.
He's
Mhm.
very selfish, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And arrogant.
And
Yeah.
arrogant.
Thank
That
you.
too,
and
yes.
and really, it's what my kids would, when they were kids, what they would have called clueless. He
Oh,
just doesn't get
get it.
He
what
doesn't get it.
grace means.
Yeah.
Right.
He thinks it's something that he possesses some right to, but nobody else should have access to that besides those whom God originally said, you are my beloved. You are my particular people. And these were not, the Ninevites were not Jews, or what they were still called Israelites at this point.
And that last sentence, God's care goes beyond people to all of creation, because he mentioned not to mention all the animals.
Yes.
All of creation.
Yeah, that seems like just kind of a throwaway. All these people and many animals or whatever it was as well. And I think that's um, that's a nice observation, Martha.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about Jonah, the message, the structure?
I have
Go ahead.
one question. I'm just curious, why would he only have this one story in the Bible? I mean, his book is one story. What's the I'm just trying to understand, and the logic behind that.
I think this was a story that we have no idea who the narrator is, who the there is a narrator. It's not Jonah speaking, although he quotes from Jonah and God a lot, but there's a narrator. We have no idea who that narrator is, but it does seem to be a carefully crafted piece of literature, not just a telling of the facts, but an artistically structured piece of literature that came down from generation to generation as story before it was a document. Somewhat like, I'm guessing, Aesop's fables or something like that. They're almost in the common domain, the public domain. We know a lot of those just because they're part of Western culture.
Sure.
But at some point, and we don't know exactly when, somebody went to the trouble of writing this story, which, again, as we've mentioned a number of times before, was very likely retold as a song, so that that cadence. There's another, in just a couple of minutes, and in the half hour that we have left, I'm going to turn our attention to an entirely different book in the Old Testament that similarly uses the repetition of, and when we get to it, you'll recognize these names, and it recounts like not the exact example, but another example would be in Exodus, where the narrator has God tell Moses, and then Moses goes and word for word repeats what God has said, and it's intended to reinforce, but it's why it was preserved. It's one of the really, really interesting things about the Bible is why the why the ancient scholars chose this collection of books. And we've talked about this before. Not everybody has agreed all along what should be in the Bible. We now have 39 books in the Old Testament. I think it's 26 or 27 books in the 27 books in the New Testament.
27.
Yeah. But that's not a given by God. God didn't give us the Bible. God gave us a whole bunch of scattered attempts to describe human relationship with God and with and with the rest of creation and with other people. This happened to be the memory of the Hebrew people. The same thing was going on in other civilizations, but their understanding, and as a consequence of their being our ancestors in the faith, our understanding is that God was doing something unique with the people, with the descendants of Abraham and Sarah. And that threefold promise that we've talked about many times, that is kind of foundational to our understanding, much more than for instance, much more than the stories of creation. The stories of creation are not the foundation of our faith.
Mm-hmm.
They're explanations of some things from our faith perspective, but they're not foundational. The understanding of a promise made to Abraham and Sarah, and for us, the understanding that the fulfillment of that promise is in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, our Savior, that ties us into that promise and to that heritage. Does that help at all, Mike?
Yeah. It was a curiosity question.
Yeah, and it is very confusing, because it would be nice if we could just say God gave us the Bible, and it's we call it the Holy Bible, we call it God's Word, as if God wrote it and just handed it to us as Scripture. We do believe, again, this is by faith. We believe that the teachings that God gave to Moses to give to the Israelites are a fair understanding of God's will for God's people. Remember, before God gives them the teachings, what we usually call the law and what we shorten to the commandments, before God gives those to the Israelites, God redeems them from their slavery in Egypt. And he brings them out in the wilderness. And he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of your slavery in Egypt. Now, therefore, live in this way. And there's a promise in kind of throughout that if you live in this way, as a beacon to the rest of the world about fairness and justice and compassion and love. If you live in that way, which is basically what the Ten Commandments tell us to do, that we, the people of Israel, will be the showcase for the world of what it means to be living in God's shalom. And the idea is that all the nations of the world will look at Israel and say, look how Israel prospers. And why do they prosper? Because they live according to a vision of shalom, shared welfare, where everybody has enough of everything that they need, and nobody has more than they need at the expense of either a fellow Israelite, or especially a widow or an orphan or a stranger or a refugee in the community. So that really becomes fundamental in the teaching of Judaism, that understanding that the law emerges in the wake of redemption, not as a precursor or something like that. It's not, and it is there are a few places in the Old Testament where you get the idea that God is saying, if you keep my commandments, then I will prosper you in the land that I'm giving you. But behind that is the understanding that the reason you keep the commandments is because you are the redeemed children of God, and that compels you to live in a way that is that is consistent with what it means to be a child of God. Any questions? Okay, I want to do a fast pivot to the book of Daniel, and you don't need to turn to it. I'm going to read it because, again, this is another situation where much of this was passed on in oral tradition, in stories, long before it was written down. Just one second.
Is this the thing you were referring to about Martin Luther? You were saying something about the story as
well. This is one of those that he kind of falls back on. Just a second, let me find this. Oh, here it is. And this will be familiar to you, but just try to hear this as if for the first time. So this is from Daniel, the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar, and that's the king in Babylon. That's Babylon. Babylon conquered the Israelite, the country of Judah, and the Nebuchadnezzar is the king who is the head of the government that oppressed, that again conquered the Jews. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. When they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, was it not three men that we threw bound into the fire? They answered, True, O king. He replied, But I see four men unbound, walking in the middle. Oops, sorry. Walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the fourth has the appearance of a god. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. The satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their head was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Isn't that a wild story?
Oh, yeah.
It'd be easier, it'd be easier to read if it was Sam, Tom, and Joe.
Right. Yeah.
That is an interesting story, though.
Yeah. And again, one of the things that's interesting is there's no record in any kind of Babylonian archive or anything like that of of any incident similar to this. There is, however, we know history outside the Bible knows of Nebuchadnezzar, and that's a real live Babylonian king, and he was the ruler who conquered conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem. Any questions or comments on that reading? Did you sense some of the humor or at least irony in the text?
Irony, yes.
Irony, yes. Humor, no, I wouldn't like in this, as I thought was the same with the story of Jonah. I think it's more irony than humor.
Okay.
in both
It's
of those
it's not ha
instances.
it's not ha ha humor
No,
like
no,
puns and things like that. No. It is
or funny situations.
right.
But it's irony, ironic.
You don't think the guy in the belly of the fish is a funny situation?
He
Uh,
didn't think so.
yeah,
He was grateful to be there,
yeah, he
considering
That's
was.
true.
considering the alternative.
That's
He's
true.
Mhm.
he saw that as a lifeboat.
Because he felt safe there, right?
Well, the fish was sent by God, and
Yeah.
it wasn't to devour him, or at least it wasn't to destroy him, to digest him. And ultimately, it was Jonah saw it as his deliverance, and yet another sign of how God is gracious. And that whole psalm that he sings from the belly of the fish is all about how incredibly gracious God is. And that's the whole thing. His whole take on God is how gracious God is, even going so far as to bring me this fish to deliver me. And as soon as he gets out and kind of moves on to the next step of his mission, then he forgets that God is a God of grace and of forgiveness, and kind of forgets that what God did for him, God could also do for these terrible, disobedient people.
And
Go
that's
ahead,
we have
Mike.
the
Mike, and then Terry.
So something I found ironic and similar in both stories is that these kings cave to the message so quickly. If they're the leader of their land,
Right.
and they see one example that there's no questioning. There's they just cave in, and maybe it's editorial liberties there. I don't know, but it
I
just
you know
people.
I think it is, and it's intended to. I think I used the analogy last week of for instance, our saying to Addison Stoodheit, go to the Kremlin and tell Putin to quit doing what he's doing,
Mhm.
and Putin agrees. Putin says, "Oh yeah, Addison, I really hadn't thought of it from the perspective of uh, a suburban high school girl." And he changes his mind. That's kind of what's
Yeah.
the transaction here. Is it's an absurd um, um, an absurd mission,
Right.
with a kind of an absurd um, response, but it sets up the whole. There's 2 or 3 times in here that um, that Jonah says, "I knew all along that you were gracious. Dang it! I shouldn't have fallen for this again. You're always gracious, and I always think that you're going to punish them, and you always disappoint me."
So yeah, I guess that in that absurdity is the lesson.
Yeah, Terry.
So I was just wondering, or just asking that that's the tie-in between those two stories, the Jonah story and the Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego
I think
stories. Is that what the
Yeah,
tie-in here
yeah.
is.
It's the use of a literary device, um, um, a a well-told story to convey um, um, convey a message that is consistent with the message of God's of God's grace, and why we continue to see this as part of our scripture. It
These
testifies it testifies to it it doesn't prove, it testifies to the abounding graciousness of God.
But these would not be considered as to be parables, though, right? It's not quite the same thing.
I, parables parables are generally very short story, very short stories.
Mhm.
You know, just two or three or four kind of exchanges,
Mhm.
as opposed to this is a pretty well developed plot, and that's not what parables are. That's not how parables work.
But
Again,
it's the same concept, I guess, maybe is what I,
a teaching story.
yes,
I would
yes.
call, yes, yes.
Yeah, maybe that's what I want
And
to say.
and 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 most when you look at most scholarship about Jonah, I mean about Old Testament, they don't, like where we have Jonah in the Bible, where we inherited it. Jonah is mixed in with the prophets, and most most scholars agree that this was a story that was eventually put down in writing, but was part of the wisdom literature of Israel, not not the chronicle of Israel's life. It wasn't the archives. It wasn't the news of Israel's life. It was, and examples of that would be um, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. These are purported to be the histories of the people of Israel once they get into, or it's actually including the conquest of the Holy Land. But books like Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Jonah are what are often referred to as the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Um, go ahead. Somebody had a question.
Oh, I thought I heard Martha say something.
Okay.
Oh, I was just, no, nothing.
Oh, okay. Any other questions? And that again is just to distinguish the kinds of books. It's never helpful to think of the Bible as a book. It's
Mhm.
always more helpful to think of it as a collection of books.
Yeah.
They're not the same genre. They're certainly not the same era. They don't all address the same issue or issues. They are a collection of um, stories, reflections, and writings from our ancient ancestors. Um, going back at least 3,000 years for most of the Old Testament. And it's, there was no kind of master plan where, Moses says, okay, I've got these first 5, and now you guys write these, and we'll put them in this cabinet, and then, as we go along, you just keep on adding to the Bible. It just didn't happen that way. It was way messier than that. Same way with the New Testament. And that frustrates some people. I marvel at it because I believe that in ways that I can't really understand, that God is at work in preserving this witness from our ancestors to us that still speaks to us in the 21st century. Closing questions. Starting in November, just for Mike and Terry, you didn't hear this. Starting in November, the first 3 Wednesdays in November, we're going to look at passages both in the Old Testament and the New Testament that speak to God's relationship to creation, and also speak about our human relationship to creation. And Jules asked just before you guys got on if there was any homework, and I would invite you to read Psalm 97 and Psalm 98. Let me check if I've got those right. Just one second. Psalm 97 and Psalm 98.
Okay.
While you were looking that up, I noticed in Martha's Bible, the New American Bible, they've got the Old Testament broken down into the Pentateuch, the historical books, the biblical novellas, the wisdom series, and the prophetic books. Very interesting.
Novella.
I've heard of that.
Mention that.
What's in the novellas?
Tobit, Judith, Esther, First and Second Maccabees. That's it.
Okay, and of those, Esther is the only one that we have in our Old Testament.
Right.
Those others are what are considered part of the Apocrypha.
Yep,
And
I was just
that's
gonna
what
say that.
that's what most Christians don't accept the Apocrypha as being part of the Bible, but some Christians do, and the Roman Catholic Church does.
Well, they hide it under the title of novella.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. But here's just a little tidbit. The book of Esther was in there as one of those novellas. Book of Esther, wonderful, weird story. Never once in the book is God mentioned.
I do remember you saying that one time. Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you want a Bible study that has nothing to do with God, we'll focus on Esther.
Yeah,
but
How did it sneak in?
but for the next 3 weeks, we're going to focus on. And And if you think of some passages that that come to mind, just kind of off the top of my head, I'm thinking, does or doesn't the Noah's flood,
Mhm.
does or doesn't that speak to relationship between God and creation, and so on. So we'll just kind of unpack that for the first 3 weeks of November. All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
thanks,